Right, ladies and gentlemen, I am Brian Lee Crowley. I am the Managing Director of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and on behalf of MLI and our event sponsor, the Latvian Ministry of Defense, I would like to welcome you to this special panel event on Russia's challenge to North American and European security. Thank you very much for coming. As you can see, there are very many of you. We've arranged a little, I think, spillover capacity out in the hall with a television monitor if you can't find a place to sit. Just a word about MLI before we get underway, in case there are some of you in the room who are not familiar with us. When we launched the Institute nearly 9 years ago, it was our ambition to provide something previously unknown in Ottawa, a national think tank in the national capital, talking about national issues to national policymakers, the national media, and the national electorate. The international think tank rankings that come out every year from the University of Pennsylvania consistently rank us the top think tank in Ottawa and one of the top 4 or 5 in the country. The same rankings found us one of the top 3 new think tanks in the world in 2013. Our first book, The Canadian Century, Moving Out of America's Shadow, a particularly prescient subtitle, if I may say, won the Sir Anthony Fisher Prize for Top Think Tank Book internationally just a few years ago. And just last year, our work on Aboriginal Canada and the natural resource economy was shortlisted for the top global prize for think tank project. And just a few months ago, we won the Prospect Magazine Prize for top social policy think tank in North America, beating out such American behemoths as the Rand Corporation with a budget of $350 million. We're hot on their tail, I can assure you. National security, defense, and foreign affairs concerns are increasingly moving to the center stage of our work, as this event attests. And within that context, as you may know, MLI has been at the forefront of discussions on NATO's defense of the Baltics, thanks mainly to the hard work of our MLI fellows, 2 of whom will be on today's panel. Canada has, as everyone knows, a key role in this joint endeavor, having taken up the leadership role as the framework nation of NATO's Enhanced Forward Presence Battle Group in Latvia. When it comes to troops on the ground, Canada's commitment to NATO's collective defense posture remains robust. Indeed, immediately prior to NATO's Brussels summit in July 2018, the Prime Minister renewed Canada's commitment for 4 more years, more than half a year prior to the expiration of the existing mandate, and in line with the recommendations that MLI has made. So, of course, we take total credit. That shows the country intends to sustain its leadership in this crucial mission. Yet we should also not be blind to the risks of this mission or the potential threat that Russia poses to NATO more generally. The nature of this challenge is the subject of today's event. To say that it is multifaceted would be an understatement, as it ranges from cyber attacks and disinformation to conventional military and nuclear menacing and asymmetric warfare. This challenge is particularly felt among the frontline Baltic countries, but it challenges the security and stability of the Atlantic Alliance itself. And through the Kremlin's incessant and all-out information warfare, it can also be felt closer to home amongst all the democracies of the West. Given these dangers, we are pleased to bring together some of the leading Canadian, European, and US thinkers on Russia's challenge to NATO. And I would again like to thank the Latvian Ministry of Defense for their generous support in sponsoring this event. And I would like to welcome Jānis Geresons, the State Secretary of the Latvian Ministry of Defense. That's the equivalent of our position of Deputy Minister, who has taken time from his busy schedule to join us today. And Jānis, where are you, Jānis? Oh, there you are. Good. I knew you were here somewhere. I just didn't know where. Jānis has been the State Secretary since August 2015. And in this capacity, he is overseeing a rapid ramping up of both the defense budget and the defense capabilities of Latvia in order to prepare that country for the challenges that it faces. In his previous position as the Undersecretary of State, Policy Director in Latvia's Ministry of Defense, he was an architect and organizer of Latvia's defense policy, defense planning, and international operations policy. He joined the Ministry of Defense after a career in Latvia's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And I understand that Yanis would like to say a few words, so please join me in welcoming him to the MLI platform. I'll get out of your way.
Well, good morning, and thank you, Brian, for organizing this event. I have to say, I feel to some extent as being at home, because I so frequently meet your soldiers in Latvia, and not only in the bases, but I think what is the most positive thing that we realize, your soldiers are doing a lot of outreach activities. And that probably is one of undervalued thing what we actually have not thought even about before we deployed this mission. Because when they go, they touch with society, and it's the best way, basically, they are the best EU ambassadors, and they are best NATO's ambassadors, because they actually show to the people and they counter Russian narrative. Therefore, I think you should be very proud of your soldiers. Certainly we are, and the thing that they're doing fabulous. On the subject of this event, I think why it is important to discuss issues. It's important because we have to understand. We have to understand threat, and we have to understand why what we're facing, because it's all about awareness. Because in 2014, when Crimea happened, and when we saw suddenly unexpected developments, we have to realize, because that was because we actually didn't care, we were careless, and it was lack of awareness. We lived in dream world, in fairy tales our partners, I would say. And we have to actually, as the situation in Russia develops, we have to follow, and we actually have to recognize how it affects us. Because, as a matter of fact, there's nothing new what Russia is doing, and why, and it's the nature of Russia. We simply have to accept that that is as Russia is, but it's, I think, more about us, how we can protect us, how we can be more resilient to all those issues that we're facing, and it's. I think we have to divide that issue. One, understanding what Russia is doing and why it's doing, but also we have to understand how to be resilient to all those things what we are facing. Because at one point, probably not Russia, but somebody other will actually exploit the same things, or the same tools what Russia now exploiting. Because I think one thing what we didn't realize is there were a shift in global processes. We were very happy about Arab Spring, we were happy about social media, we were happy about many things that were happening, but that happened until the Western world or democracy was actually the dominating one and attractive power, center of power. Once I think we lost that moment when it actually started change occurred. And therefore, suddenly we realized that all the social media, cyber, internet, everything can be used against us. And it can be used by anybody. It's not only about Russia. Therefore, I think the big issue is how to counter all those things and make our society resilient, because it's not only about the military force, but it's also about every citizen of our society. Because if somebody feels insecure, military force will not help. And that is why we currently discovered that even with all rapid military development, on our own capabilities, and of course additional forces what Canadian leadership provides us, we need to be more focusing also on our comprehensive approach. We will develop comprehensive defense, where which will focus not only on military, but also whole society issues like industry, like civil defenses. Basically, what we need to consider how to make people more secure and confident in the future. But when it comes to Russia, then I think it's we've seen that during Soviet time, and I don't know why people lost. For example, there were this in United States even committee of which actually dealt with propaganda issues in during Cold time, and it was nothing different actually. What changed technologies. Now we have social media, we have internet, we have the time changed because everything happens very quickly, and therefore we have to adjust to all those issues. And Russia simply exploring. Russia has a symptom of inferiority because they want to keep the Soviet part of Soviet ideology, and they only equal what they regard as United States. And of course, it's very difficult to keep equality with the United States if your GDP is less than Canada, as a matter of fact. Therefore, I think we have to give credit to Russians. They found the most effective ways how to affect us, and that is information operations, psychological informations, electronic warfare, because once we develop more and more capabilities based on technologies, we have to be aware that basically that increases immediately our vulnerability, starting from many other things. But that's how Russia uses their soft power, and they, I think they found again our weak spots, and that I think is the big issue what we have to deal with. The problem for us, I think, also is there is no similar rules of the game. We are trying to play according to one playbook, and Russians are playing completely with a different playbook. And we have to somehow think where we are and how we can protect our values, because at the end, those are people. That is people's willingness to protect their values, what they believe in, and I think that is basically big issue for us, because if you look on Russia, those people are ready to fight, and also not only Russia, but also the Muslim extremists actually do the same. They are ready to fight for, not for salaries, they are ready to fight for idea. But we somehow, lost those values, what we are ready to be defended. And I think we have to more take that kind of look. But of course, thank you very much for today's event. I hope we will be able to discover all and discuss those issues related to developments in Russia and how Russia affects us. There, I think, a lot to learn and to share. As I said, we have to, at the end, build awareness and resilience of our societies. Thank you very much.
Well, I'm delighted to hear that Latvians are having such a positive experience with our troops. All I can say is don't ever get on the ice with them. Because anybody who thinks that Canadians are nice has never played hockey. Ladies and gentlemen, we have far too many distinguished and noteworthy people in the room for me to mention them all, but I will say that we're extremely delighted to see such a great turnout from the diplomatic community, the academic community, the political community, and the bureaucratic community, everybody in Ottawa who can affect the thinking in this country about these issues is here today, and I salute you all for coming. Thank you. Those of you, by the way, who would like to tweet about today's event while it's going on, we certainly encourage you to do so. And the hashtag that we're using for today's event is, I think, Russia's Challenge. Hashtag Russia's Challenge. And we are ML Institute on Twitter. So please feel free to let people outside the room know about the things that you're hearing that you think are particularly noteworthy. And now it's my distinct pleasure to turn to our keynote speaker for today's event, Tom Nichols. Tom also almost didn't make it because he learned what every Canadian learns at his or her mother's knee, that you cannot trust Air Canada. He was getting on a train in Providence and got an email saying that his flight had been canceled. We managed to pull things together. He got here, I think had 5 minutes to make a connection in the Montreal airport, but he managed, and I think that's a sign of his commitment to being here with us today. So I think we should, anybody who can overcome Air Canada's resistance to travel. Yeah, I'm not done yet, Tom. That was just about Air Canada. Now it's about you. Tom's reputation and profile are so distinguished that I'm sure everybody in this audience knows who he is. But for the record, let me just remind you that Tom is Professor of National Security Affairs at the U.S. Naval War College and an adjunct professor in the Harvard Extension School. In his Washington days, Tom was a fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. That's their CSIS, not our CSIS, a consultant to the U.S. government and a research analyst for private industry. Later, he served as an advisor on foreign and defense affairs to the late U.S. Senator John Heinz of Pennsylvania. And in what is surely his most untoppable qualification, he is also a 5-time undefeated Jeopardy champion. His most recent book is Death of Expertise, The Campaign Against Established Knowledge and Why It Matters. Tom, could I please invite you to come to the podium and address the meeting? And perhaps the best way to frame Tom's talk is in the time-honored Jeopardy fashion. If Russia's challenge to North American and European security is the answer, what, Tom, is the question?
Well, thank you for having me, and I don't want to blame Air Canada. I'm going to assume it was Russian sabotage, but I made it despite their efforts. First, of course, the first thing I should tell you is that I don't represent the views of the United States government. I'm here speaking in my own capacity and from my own views. You know, I was asked to talk about the view from America. And the first thing I would say about Russia's challenge to the West, because it is to the West, it's not just the United States or to the Baltic states, it is an all-fronts attack on the West. But I'm sorry to say that I think that there is no view from America, but there are several views from America about this issue. Some Americans see this whole issue of a Russian attack against the West as nonsense, as politically motivated, primarily as a means of trying to undermine the Trump administration, a very inside baseball kind of Washington problem, the thing that we old school Cold Warriors can't let go of. The president himself encourages this, I think, when he's on the road, when he says, would it be so bad if I got along with Russia and Putin? And so right off the bat, there is a segment of the American public that just does not take this very seriously. And I think that's unfortunate. There's a second view that sees this as somewhat important but not crucial. That If you talk to this segment of Americans, you will get an answer something like, well, of course the Russians, the wiggle word we use here is meddled, that the Russians meddled, but that's just Russians doing what Russians do. And that it wasn't particularly effective or important. It's just another day in the big jungle. And I think, again, there are concerns. You can never separate this from the extremely sharp and divided partisan situation in the United States right now. And so, again, for a lot of these folks, the answer is that, yes, the Russians are always out there causing mischief, but it did not affect our elections. Now, I actually take a third view that I think most of the people that I know in the community of Russia scholars and Russia experts in the United States take, which is that I think that Russia's recent activity in the past few years has been unprecedented, approaching an act of war and a direct attack on American and allied political institutions. And so far, they've gotten away with it. Now, again, it's difficult to pull this apart from the partisan situation. I understand there's some things going on in Washington today, and so let me again say how glad I am to be in Canada, and may I stay.
Yes.
Forever. Yes.
You just have to go to Roxham Road. And
I have resisted for quite a while the notion that the Russians, despite my sense that this, again, is essentially an act of war, that this is over the line. Now, I should say about my own background, I came up as a young Soviet expert, and the fact that I just used that word tells you how old I am. I would say that I was never, that I grew up as a early trained Cold Warrior. I argued for better relations between the West and Russia for the Yeltsin years and even into the first few years of the Putin regime. And I was finally talked out of that by Vladimir Putin and his activities. Nonetheless, I too resisted the notion that the Russians had somehow changed the American election outcome, and until I see better evidence. Now, there's a book that has just been released from Oxford University Press. I'm always glad to give them a shout out since I work with them as well, called Cyber War, in which a case, Kathleen Hall Jamieson makes the case that, and as much as we can be certain, she would argue that it's highly likely that Russian propaganda actually swung the American election. I have not read the book yet. I haven't reached a judgment about this. I don't think you need to reach that conclusion, again, in order to accept that what the Russians have done was, again, to me, functionally an act of aggression against the West that really went beyond the kind of hijinks that we pulled on each other, quite honestly, during the Cold War. There were limits during the Cold War. There were lines that could not be crossed during the Cold War. And what strikes me about the current Russian situation is that they see no limits whatsoever. The Russians seem to see no restraining influence on their activity at all. And this worries me because I suspect that before the next few years are out, they will test us, not only politically in the cyber realm and in the espionage world, but I suspect they're going to test us militarily somehow. Probably through a terrible miscalculation about whether or not we're capable of responding to them. I also wanted to point out that my view, I try to take a larger view about this because I think Americans have become obsessive about this one issue, Did the Russians meddle, a word I don't like. I prefer the word attack. Did the Russians attack American political institutions? Not just our electoral system, not just working through propaganda and falsifying stories and other disinformation efforts. Did they attack our political parties, which to me are a part of our political institutions? And I think the answer is undoubtedly. Through their, I think one thing that Americans, been an interesting change to see in America, that I said years ago that WikiLeaks was essentially a subsidiary of the Russian intelligence service. A lot of people didn't like hearing that years ago, and it's nice to live long enough to see your outrageous opinion become the conventional wisdom. But it took a little while. But I think we've become overly obsessive about this notion of an attack on our political institutions, and we've forgotten that this is actually a full spectrum attack on us and all of our allies, and throughout the West, broadly conceived, even beyond NATO. And I think this is, again, lost in the immense insular, inward-looking partisan bickering that is obsessing Washington and the American people right now. And I think that's unfortunate. The question to me is, what is it the Russians are trying to achieve? Because one objection you'll get in the United States to all of this is, well, so the Russians are, dumping propaganda on us. I think that the original Russian intent, by the way, insofar as we can divine it, was that their initial mischief 2 years ago was to undermine what they thought was going to be an incoming Hillary Clinton administration. I think initially they weren't actually trying to swing the American election or affect its outcome. They were simply trying to, because we all know about the warm, cordial relations between Vladimir Putin and Hillary Clinton. I think they saw themselves as weighting down an incoming Clinton administration with scandals and questions and classified materials and stolen emails and all of that stuff. And I think that was just, again, for the Russians, a kind of a low-cost, moderate payoff move. And then things started to get out of control. And I think that their goal moved from undermining a Clinton administration to actually seeing if they could move the American public back and forth and whipsaw them between these candidates. Now, with that said, I've made this argument elsewhere as well, that the goal is not to actually promote a Russian line. This is one difference, I think, between the current Russian approach and the old Soviet approach. One thing that was almost reassuring about the Soviets is how predictable they were. Their propaganda was so bad, and it was so predictable, I could have written it myself. It shows you what a facile and easy form of communication it was that, those of us who studied the old Soviet Union could start speaking to each other as though we were party members, we simply not tolerating any of this right deviationism from our, friends among the wreckers. And this is different. I don't think there is any Russian line that they're pushing. I think rather Putin's goal and the Russian goal is not to convince Western societies of something. It is to convince them of nothing. It is to paralyze them. It is to completely overwhelm the critical faculties of the average Western citizen to the point of incoherence. I did a few speaking tours in the Czech Republic over the past few years, working with the State Department. And if we think it's bad here in the United States and Canada and here in North America, to go to Central Europe, I'm sure as our Baltic colleagues can tell you, the amount of Russian disinformation and general information, interference in the information sphere is staggering. I mean, it makes what's happening in the United States look almost like a rehearsal. To go to Central Europe is to be in an environment where Russian disinformation falls out of the sky like acid rain. constantly. And talking to young people in places like Central Europe, and I went from the Polish border to across the country, it's having an effect that young people increasingly, both here in the United States and in Europe, say things like, well, you know, a lot of things can be true, and maybe nothing is true. And, you know, the Russians, well, they lie, but everybody lies. And there's really no reason to believe in anything. This, to me, this is the goal of the Russian effort, is to completely annihilate the civic engagement of a coming generation of young people in the democracies. It is to make them pull away from public life and civic engagement and to throw up their hands and to say, nothing matters. Anything could be a lie. Anything could be true. Information has no provenance. It simply exists. This is a problem in general that I wrote about in my last book, that young people in particular think that things in cyberspace and on the internet exist in the same way that planets and stars and asteroids exist, because they're just there. They're not the result of any kind of human agency. And I think that this actually serves a Russian purpose. It serves three Russian purposes. First, it makes the Russian regime seem not so bad. It makes the Russian regime seem normal. Well, you know, Putin's a bad guy, but, you know, we've heard terrible things about, you know, Hillary. So when I was in the Czech Republic, somebody said, well, what about, you know, Hillary Clinton running a child prostitution ring out of a pizza restaurant? It was an interesting moment, because the young man who asked me, I said, we're not going to talk about it. I said, it's a fake story. And I looked at him and I said, and he kind of smiled and I said, and you know it's a fake story, don't you? And he said, well, I'm just asking questions. I said, that is the eternal dodge of the propagandist. I said, look, you're a very intelligent young man. You know this story is fake. He says, well, it could be, but, and finally afterwards he came up and he said, I said, you were just trying to see if you could link the word Hillary Clinton to the word pedophile enough times. And cleverly, the young man nodded and he went, yeah. He said, I just don't like her. I said, well, there's a whole audience of people that, you know, I said, you know this is a fake story. And he said, maybe. Again, I don't think, I think that that is part of, that's one of the Russian goals. Say, well, Putin's bad, but you have a bunch of, you know, racist, pedophile, whatever's running the Western governments. The second, I think, is to split apart the Western alliance, to drain the values away through this kind of disinformation. Freedom, liberty, what does all that mean? These are just words. Words don't mean anything. I have plenty of freedom. I am an autonomous person. I can go to the internet or turn on a radio station. I don't, you know, the notion that one system is better than the other. I don't really need these Canadians in my country tromping around, or these boorish Americans clumping through my town. You know, this is that just puts me in danger, and I don't really have any issue or beef with anybody else. And I think it's meant to pull apart the Western alliance by dissolving the values that underlie it. Now, the old Soviet goal was to replace those values with, you know, sort of insane post-Bolshevik nonsense about real socialism and actually existing socialism and the fraternal brotherhood and all that. I won't use the word, but as Ronald Reagan once said, it has deep roots in our agricultural community. And finally, on a very practical level, I think the goal is to paralyze the West so that the Russians have greater freedom of action to do whatever it is they want to do. It's to create an open space, an open playing field And in part, again, not because the Russians are the old Soviets. The old Soviet Union had a globe-spanning ideology, and it worked very hard to spread that and to gain new adherents. Every new allied state to the Soviet Union was one more piece of evidence that the Soviet idea was legitimate. The Russians, I think, want greater latitude to act, in part because they are a completely transactional regime, and almost all of that regime's activities are based on the fact that it is run by a mafia family whose boss needs to stay in power. And there are many ways that boss stays in power. Primarily, he does that by providing goods and services to his lieutenants and capos. Partly, it's by keeping his own people scared of him. Or in classic mafia fashion, keeps part of the population afraid of him and the other part of the population grateful for his largesse. And I think when he is limited in his activity, when he's limited in what he can do in places like Crimea, if he had been limited there, or Syria, or Ukraine, that undermines his stability. And in the end, I would argue that I actually don't believe, I should pause here for a moment and say, I don't believe that Putin is a Russian nationalist or a neo-Soviet Bolshevist or any of those things. I think the two ways I think of Putin, one is that he is a Soviet nostalgist, which is that he does not want the old Soviet ideology back. He just wants 1975 back. Those were good days for him. And if you think back to 1975, the Soviet Union's on the ascent. It's a power practically equal to the United States. The United States in 1975, hard to recall that we were once worse off than we are now, but we once were, with a president and a vice president that no one had elected. An unprecedented moment in American politics. We had just been defeated in Vietnam. Our economy was a shambles. We were suffering from a word that my students, every time students tell me how awful everything is, I say, the fact that you don't understand what the word stagflation means tells me that you don't know how bad it can be. And I think Putin just looks back fondly on that. This is a guy who tears up when he hears the Soviet national anthem. So I think he kind of wants, I think in some ways we're dealing with a man who's having the most dangerous midlife crisis in history. So I think that's part of it, but also I think he is riding the tiger. I think somewhere around, now, and I should add, by the way, around 2001, 2002, it may be the worst professional mistake I ever made, but I said, this Putin guy, he might not be so bad. I think there were a lot of us at the time who said, seems like a kind of a bureaucrat, might be, impose a little order on the Federation, repair some of the bilateral kind of improvisation that Yeltsin had done. I think by the time, whether I was wrong about that or whether Putin changed, it was irrelevant, I think, by the time he ran for a third term. And I think that third term, when he came back to power, was his way of saying, I don't feel safe unless I'm in charge. And he's not going to leave. That's the end of it. He has decided he must rule for the rest of his life. And he is, to use that wonderful expression, he is riding a tiger from which he dare not dismount now. And so I think that is the freedom of action that he seeks in the international community. So now that I've been completely depressing about all of this, let me make it worse. I do not believe there is a government or official political remedy to this. In the United States in particular, I am very concerned about how the Americans talk about government solutions to this that I think violate are straight up violations of our First Amendment rights. We have to control Facebook. We have to control Twitter. The government has to control social media. This, to me, as a limited government conservative, and there are a couple of us left, I find appalling. It is anathema to me. When people ask me, what should we do, though, about people being lied to on Facebook? My answer is stop getting your news from Facebook. Tell your friends not to get their news from Facebook. Teachers should be telling their students, don't get your news. Look, I have a Facebook account. Everybody has a Facebook account. It's like having a credit card now. It's just one of those things. I have a very active Twitter account, as some of you may know. But I think that the only thing that will stop this is social pressure, peer pressure, public intellectuals finally taking on their responsibility to shout back at the crowd, which I think public intellectuals have been loath to do because the charge of becoming an elitist, and particularly in the United States, is now worse than being called a communist. And I think as well that there has to be some kind of return, either, again, through schooling, through education, the universities stepping up and taking their responsibility to restore the notion of civic virtue, to talk about what makes the West worth defending. You cannot solve this by having the government censor Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or any of those things. The information sphere is simply too porous to control, and every effort to control it will result in a decline in our civil liberties. So it's a bigger problem than that. We have, I guess, it's a way of saying we just have to become better people and raise a better generation behind us. But we can't become the thing just as during the Cold War, and I'll end here, just as during the Cold War, we cannot become the thing we're fighting against. And we really have to take care not to let that happen. I don't think this situation is irretrievable, but I think we are in for a long slog here, just as we were here in this second strange Cold War that we're in, and I think we are in a second Cold War now, that this is going to be a long slog that requires relying on our values as members of Western democracies. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Well, as Alex Trebek would say, can you phrase that as a question? Ladies and gentlemen, there was so much material there. I have to say, though, that I was particularly struck by what Tom said about both the predictability of the old Soviet propaganda and the date of 1975, because I don't know why this came to mind, but it did. In 1976, the first Parti Québécois government was elected in Canada. And I remember very well the advisor on foreign affairs to René Lévesque, Yves Michaud, was asked about an editorial that appeared in Pravda on the occasion of the election of this government, and the reaction of the Soviet establishment was, they're merely a petty bourgeois nationalist movement. That entirely predictable response. And journalist put a microphone in Yves Michaud's face and said, "So, Mr. Michaud, is this just a petty bourgeois government?" And Michaud looked off in the distance for a moment, and then he said, "Bourgeois, oui, mais pourquoi petit?" Okay. Thank you, Tom, for that indispensable context for our discussion. The rest of the program for this morning's event will consist of a panel discussion under the leadership of moderator Alexandra Gaichu. Have I pronounced that correctly? Good. It'll never happen again, believe me. Alexandra will introduce the panelists, so it only remains for me to introduce her and hand over the podium to her. Alexandra is an associate professor at the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs, and Associate Director of the Center for International Policy Studies at the University of Ottawa, our close neighbor here in Sandy Hill. Her research interests are in the fields of international security, international institutions, Euro-Atlantic relations, global governance, state rebuilding, and international relations theory. And prior to joining the University of Ottawa, she was a research fellow at University of Oxford and a Jean Monnet fellow at the European University Institute in Florence. Nice work if you can get it. Alexandra, over to you.
Thank you so much. Shall we all come here? Thank you so much, Brian. Thank you. Perhaps I could invite all of you to join us on the stage. Let me thank the Institute MRI for hosting this wonderful event and for giving me the chance to be a part of what has already been a fascinating discussion, and I'm sure it will get even more interesting. And as Tom mentioned a few moments ago, when it comes to international security, there is almost nothing that experts and practitioners can agree on. They disagree on absolutely everything. So when they do begin to agree on something, at least to some extent, you know that a significant development is unfolding on the international stage. And today, for all the persisting disagreements in some circles, there is a growing sense that, as you've learned this morning, that Russia is posing a set of complicated, multifaceted challenges to the Western security community, which of course has long defined itself around core liberal democratic values and institutions. And in this context, I think you will agree with me that we are particularly fortunate to have, in addition to the brilliant speakers you've already listened to this morning, two additional famous experts on international security. And it is my great pleasure. I know they will help us gain an even better understanding on the nature and potential implications of the threat posed by Russia. So without further ado, it is my great pleasure to briefly, and I have to say briefly, introduce them because I couldn't possibly do justice to their CVs in just a couple of minutes. But let me just try to highlight a couple of their achievements. And we have Marcus Kolga, who is an international award-winning documentary filmmaker, journalist, digital communication strategist, and a leading Canadian expert on Russian and Central and East European issues. He is a senior fellow with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute and the author of a forthcoming MLI paper on Russian disinformation and influence campaigns. And of course, last but certainly not least, Alexander Moens. She's a professor and chair of political science at Simon Fraser University in beautiful Vancouver, and a senior fellow at the MLI. He is the author of a recent MLI paper titled Fear and Dread, Russia's Strategy to Dismantle North Atlantic and European Security Cooperation. And he is also, importantly, the director of the Canada NATO Field School and Simulation Program. Thank you so much. Without further ado, if I could invite our panelists to briefly state a few points, a few key points, maybe 3 to 5 minutes, and then we'll move on to the moderated discussion. Thank you. Marcus?
I'm happy to go first.
Perfect.
Okay. So very impressive comments, Tom. I really strongly agree with almost everything you say, as well as Janis, what you say. I want to make 4 very quick points because I understand the purpose is Q&A. The first point is, let's distinguish between Russian power and Russian legitimacy. Sometimes in the West, I noticed this in the academic and the journalistic community, and I very much like the idea of public academics, although I'm not sure if the word public is the right word, but the idea of us using our time and research and experience to help the Canadian public think about these things. But very important, I don't think we should use ideas like waning great power or spoiler state, or what President Obama once said, Russia is a regional power. Russia is a great power. The nature of its nuclear weaponry, its energy resources, its geographic strategic location make Russia a great power. And there's nothing lost by treating and writing and speaking about it, because the point is its legitimacy. What it does at home and what it does abroad is plain wrong. In this sense, we respected Russia as a great power also when we built the Helsinki process, mentioning 1975. The Helsinki process of trying to use any format in which Russia essentially just wanted to be recognized as a great power, but then using all of these forums to push back towards legitimacy, legitimate foreign behavior. Secondly, in Canada especially, we have to be very careful about this idea that Putin and Moscow tries to spread, namely that somehow we in the West lost Russia because of NATO enlargement, because of the failure of liberalism in the 90s in Russia, because we didn't follow Gorbachev's common European home, which we can talk about in the Q&A if you wish. But NATO enlargement is the key. That is a story where if we don't know what we're doing, we're going to lose half of the debate with Russia. NATO enlargement is very complex, but written about very carefully. There is a public record to know what is going on. NATO enlargement was a policy conundrum. It was something that East Europe, Central Europe really wanted. US domestic politics got involved during the Clinton era. But essentially, NATO was not driving this. And what happened was NATO enlargement really became NATO enlargement light. No nuclear weapons, no stationed forces. Essentially, NATO only enlarged de jure to the east. And the real line remained Norway, Germany, Italy. Greece, of course. Turkey. But this was the beef of many Central and Eastern European countries later, that there was nothing NATO. NATO was an emperor without clothes in Central and Eastern Europe. That began only to change in 2016. We didn't lose NATO. We didn't lose Russia. We expanded NATO because what other option was there? Break international law, keep Central Eastern Europe out of the EU, and essentially let Yalta stand. We didn't do it to lose Russia. We did it because there was no other option. Thirdly, I want to mention that the Allied frustration from Ottawa all the way through Europe with the Trump administration is, of course, very understandable, very real, sky high. What we have, I think the two things immediately that we notice is that Trump stopped American exceptionalism, stopped values, stopped the whole notion that we are a value as well as an interest alliance of different democracies. In addition to that, he took the very common American unilateralist thing to a new level, sort of a Mount Everest level, that is very difficult for anybody to work with. So I can understand why many countries these days are really looking at their options. It's certainly happening in Germany. But let's be very careful about how we talk about this, because if you look at the options of an absence of American leadership, they don't look very good. Would we have another great power? Who would it be? China? Would it be the EU? I think in terms of values and principles, Canada would be happy with such a thing. But it would be a giant mistake, because the European Union is not, never will be, a kind of a real power. It's not an emperor without clothes. It's simply not an emperor. And we cannot, as Canadians, afford to hang our national interests on the EU becoming something different. So what I notice now in Western diplomacy is this idea of France, Germany, Britain, Japan, Canada, Australia, talking about, you know, middle powers sort of compensating for American superpower. I want to urge some caution about that. The international system and the international structure, the great powers and the configuration of power among them, cannot be decided by middle powers. You cannot substitute it. So whatever coalition you put together, it will not be a substitute. So that leaves us essentially with how do we think about working with a changed America, and how can we affect the change? I think Canada is absolutely right in this robust multilateralism, transatlanticism, but let's make sure it doesn't become an either-or thing vis-a-vis our relationship with the United States, because that's a very dangerous road for us to go on. My last point is on information warfare, and I agree with Tom and Janis that, you know, we are not going to fight disinformation with our own disinformation. We are not going to fight lies with lies. If we are not values, if we are not peace through legitimate strength, we're nothing. We'll be just another Russia. So we must do this, but I am encouraged that we can. Now, I don't want to say too much about this, but one of the methods I found encouraging is I take my students for 8 weeks, and I don't just send them home every Tuesday afternoon. We're together, and we go to places, and we work together on how to think about these things. For example, we spent 1 day at the Center of Excellence for Strategic Communication in Riga. Fantastic center, by the way. I think Canada is joining it now, and it's worthwhile for us to be really involved. My students, all 40 of them, spend a whole day learning how do Russian organizations create bot programs. How do they create this? How can you understand that? How can you read this? How can you notice this? So they got a kind of a short course in understanding when nonsense happens. For example, these innocent 40 Canadian students, within 2 weeks, were attacked by Russian information. All they were doing was taking the NATO field school offered in Vancouver, Canada. Boom, they got them. So not only did Russia get them, but they were taught how that works and what that means. And now they're changed. Now they can have a skill package whereby they can start to fight back. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Well, I'd just like to pick up on something that Alex was saying about NATO and Central and Eastern Europe, especially the Baltic states, being relatively empty up until 2016, at least bereft of any real NATO infrastructure. In 2009, as a filmmaker, I had the opportunity to go to Brussels and do an interview with the Russian permanent representative to NATO. And up until that time, and we've seen it now as well, Russian propaganda really focuses on the fact that NATO is an imperialistic organization, and it's really pushed Russia to the brink. It's pushed Russia's own numbers in its western military region up to 300,000. It's forced Russia to open all sorts of bases across the Arctic. And so I sat down with an interview with Ambassador Korchunov, and I asked him, I said, well, if this is what you're saying, that NATO is really pushing you to militarize your western region, what sort of infrastructure are you seeing? He said, well, all sorts of infrastructure, all sorts of NATO military infrastructure. They're building it all over the Baltics. And I asked him, I pressed him, I said, which ones? Where is this happening? And he couldn't come up with one. And his answer in the film is, well, there isn't one yet. And this has been the Russian story, or the Kremlin's propaganda story, all along. I just wanted to pick up on another thing that both Tom and Janis mentioned, that the real focus of Russian disinformation, what their goal is right now, is really to undermine our democracy. And this, in the Canadian context, just like you were speaking in the US context, in the Canadian context, it's the same. The Kremlin disinformation is trying to undermine our democracy, and it's really trying to break apart our alliances. And what we're seeing is that most of the response, we've seen an acknowledgement from the Canadian government. In fact, yesterday the Prime Minister at the UN acknowledged the fact that the 2015 elections were probably hacked, probably didn't have too much an effect, but there is an acknowledgement, at least, that this is happening. I think in Canada we're focusing far too much on our elections, and we're not looking enough at our democracy. It's really our democracy and our society and our institutions right now that are under attack. We've seen it time and time again, whether it's our Minister of Foreign Affairs being attacked for things that her grandfather may have, the associations that her grandfather may have had during the Second World War. It's our troops in Latvia. They're also being targeted. There have been several disinformation reports and basically fabrications in Russian-speaking newspapers in Latvia about them. One is that our defense minister this was about a year ago, that our defense minister is leading an army of Muslims to take over Latvia. Another report had a photo of Russell Williams, the convicted serial killer, in women's lingerie. The article said that this is a Canadian colonel who's leading a gay army to Latvia to homosexualize the country, if that's a word, homosexualize. These are just small examples of how Canada is part of this disinformation warfare, and we really need to do much more. It may not be a government response, but I think one of the ways that we can push back against this, especially coming up onto this 2019 parliamentary election, is by, one example would be to start a literacy campaign. The Swedish government just did this. They had an election this summer, and they had a nationwide literacy campaign about what disinformation looks like. This is something that we could be doing. We're not going to turn off Facebook. We're not going to turn off Twitter. Even Russia today, that pumps in all sorts of nonsense. And I can talk about this later, some of the stuff that they send into Canada about Canadian news. We're not going to turn these things off, but we can educate Canadians about what disinformation looks like, so that when we see it, we can reject it, or at least look at it critically and not take it for what it is. So I think I'll just end it there, because I think we really want to get into the Q&A.
Well, before we do that, thank you so much to both of you. Really, really fascinating themes.
Can I add one?
Please do. Please do.
I'd like to add one other example. One of the stories I had to deal. Am I on?
Yeah, you're on.
Okay. One of the stories I had to deal with when I was overseas was a question of, why are you Americans moving your nuclear weapons from Turkey to Romania? Mm-hmm. And I said, and it turned out to be, a Russian-sponsored fabrication from the get-go, and within 72 hours, it had gone around the world. And again, partly to break apart our alliances, right? To have people in Central Europe saying, why are you moving nuclear weapons around, and what's going on? But there's one other part to this that I think is important to journalists. It is to overwhelm journalistic fact-checking to the point where they drown in trying to keep up with it. Because after about 72 hours, finally, I think Foreign Policy magazine did a quick piece saying, no, this isn't happening. But the fact that a journalist, I mean, everybody only has so much bandwidth to deal with. And the fact that a Western journalist had to sit down and say, how did this happen? No, it's not really happening. This story is completely false. And that was like just putting one cork in one leak in this, torrent of stuff coming. So I think that's one of the institutions that's being attacked, is the institutions of free journalism. Again, not by casting them so much as liars, but by simply overwhelming them with so much bad information that they simply cannot keep up.
If I can just quickly add to that, and then we'll move on. I was at the CBC over the summer, and I was speaking to a senior producer there at a fairly well-known political show. And we were talking about the situation with disinformation. And the senior producer told me that you wouldn't believe how many junior producers come to him every single week pitching stories that they saw on RT. This is the CBC. This is a junior producer pitching a story they saw on RT. It's happening. And the senior producer said, well, I mean, every time he laughs them out of the office. But it's happening. So it's nothing that we can control with our government, but it is a question of awareness and literacy.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, I have no doubt that you have many burning questions, and have no fear, we will get to them. But before we move to that part of the show, we do have a few minutes for a moderated discussion. So I would invite our panelists to tell us more about some of the themes that they've just mentioned. If I could get us started by looking at NATO, because the question of NATO came up a lot. And if I could invite you to say more about what you think NATO needs to do in order to respond effectively to this multifaceted challenge posed by Russia. We remember at the NATO summit just a few months ago, there was, well, first of all, there was a moment of existential crisis. Sorry, Tom, because of President Trump. But after that, there was a moment of optimism where most allies said, yes, we are moving in the right directions. Yes, NATO has seen the light. Yes, there is light at the end of the tunnel. Would you agree with that assessment? Or do you think we still have quite a bit to go before NATO can mount an effective response to Russia? What might be the challenges involved in providing an effective response? And perhaps not least, what happens if NATO fails? Would you like, Alex, would you like to get us started?
Sure, I'll say a few things. You know, I think it would be very helpful to think of two things. First, with 29 member states, NATO is politically quite vulnerable. Vulnerable in the sense of consensus. It's bedrock mechanism. Getting consensus on anything with 29 is tough. The way we dealt with that during the Cold War is we had careful, and I want to emphasize the word careful, we had carefully mediated ways of empowering SACEUR, Supreme Allied Commander Europe, American general, to empower SACEUR with a certain amount of capability to move. And since NATO has been spending the last 25 years on crisis management everywhere else in the world, countries have become very nervous about giving an American general that kind of leeway. But I think NATO has to think about how to do that and do a little bit more. Now, in addition to that, I agree with Tom that the risk of Russia probing militarily somewhere is quite high, including Ukraine. And I know Ukraine is not a member state. But therefore, the idea of pure tripwiring, which is simply the presence of NATO forces in Eastern Europe and so on, we might have to think about how to make those more robust. For example, our own case, the Canadian case. We have a very capable battle group there. We visited them this summer. But the vulnerabilities that exist in terms of what that means beyond a political statement are a little bit too high. The Germans is higher. The German problems are even greater. So capability in terms of having more than tripwire capacity and delegating certain amount of power to SACEUR so that the Russians know that they cannot play around with consensus at 29 because SACEUR can move. Thank you.
Thank you. No?
Well, it's an uncomfortable question for me because 25 years ago, I was one of the people arguing for going slower on NATO expansion. I had cause to think of this about 2 years ago when I was in Bratislava, where I found myself saying, I wish I hadn't said that 25 years ago, and I'm glad you're in NATO now. Because again, I genuinely believed that a return to this kind of aggressive autocracy in Russia was a pretty low probability event in the 90s. And I thought that, you know, a slow and steady increase in NATO membership was a better approach than what the Clinton administration did, which, as you know, we've already pointed out up here, got wound up into American partisan politics. But with that said, yeah, 29 nations does create a political vulnerability. Once again, I think the question is not how to counter the, at least let me talk about the information sphere for a second. The answer is not how to counter the Russians in the information sphere. You can't do that. You simply cannot, they can create lies and chaff and static in the information space always faster than you can possibly answer it. I know there's been talk about a kind of NATO informational rapid reaction center, and that'd be great. I think, you know, that there's no reason not to do that. But again, this is going to have to rest within the governments of NATO, who right now, you know, again, always my personal view on this, but right now NATO is suffering from a really, and I will say this in a bipartisan way, for a while now, NATO has been suffering from a lack of American leadership. And that we need to re-engender a sense of purpose, that NATO exists for a reason. It is not a convenience, it's not a club. NATO has a purpose for existence that's rooted in the kinds of governments that we are and the kinds of societies that we are. And I think that's something we've been letting fall to the wayside in a lot of, I would argue, fairly ancillary debates. And I would fault the Americans heavily for this because, again, if we want to be the leaders of an alliance, we need to act like the leaders of an alliance. But I don't think, I would rather, to use a medical, and I'll stop here, to use a medical metaphor, I would rather try to inoculate NATO's population against Russian disinformation than to try to treat every single case of disinformation after the fact. I think we have to get ahead of this and to make, Yannis's word was resilience. I think resilience is what we ought to be striving for here. And I think we haven't done that very well in the past few years.
Okay, thank you.
Just picking up on that metaphor, I think that inoculating the Baltic region, inoculating Canada from this virus of disinformation, that's what we really need to do. I think the greatest fear, and I'm straying a bit off the subject, my greatest fear is that this sort of behavior, this disinformation, the fabrication of all these lies and pushing them into the media, that this will take a life of its own, that we'll have extreme left groups, extreme right groups in Canada, in the US, around the world, picking up on these tactics, and that this will become a regular occurrence that we have absolutely no control over. And that will be devastating for our democracy. Just quickly on NATO, I think in the Baltic region at least, and speaking as an Estonian, I think there's, I mean, we're quite happy that NATO has its EFPs in the region. I think there's still lingering concern about the Narva scenario. The Narva scenario, for those of you who don't know, is this thought, I mean, going back to 2007 where we had the Bronze Soldier riots in Tallinn, which were fermented clearly by the Russian embassy in Tallinn. They found a group of young Russians and they rioted in Tallinn when a Bronze Soldier, a Soviet monument was removed from the center of the city. Taking that, there's some concern that you could use a city like Narva on the far east border of Estonia. It's a stone's throw literally from Russia. There's a river that runs between Russia and Estonia. The thought goes that the Russians could send little green men, maybe a couple of 100 meters over the border, and to help some. There could have been some sort of provocation or some sort of a crisis, and those little green men go across the border to protect those ethnic Russians. We know that protecting compatriots is a primary objective of Vladimir Putin's. So they go across these little green men are 250 meters across the border. They're in essentially the center of Narva, and they stop. What does NATO do? Does NATO go to war over 250 meters of territory? So I think that with the EFP and the tripwire in Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania, I think the concern is gone, but that's still lingering. And what could really help with that, I think, is a permanent NATO presence in the Baltics. And that would, any sort of fears about any Narva scenarios would dissipate with that.
Okay, thank you. Well, picking up on some of the themes that you just mentioned, you said several times, it cannot be just a governmental response. Given the nature of the threat, given the complexity of the problem, this has got to be a broader, more comprehensive response. So the question then becomes, what would that require? What kind of roles would you envisage for non-state actors, be they public or private? Do we need a more systematic, perhaps new forms of partnerships between the public sector and the private sector? Do we need a more systematic engagement by civil society organizations? How do we bring all of this together? If I could invite you to address this theme for a moment, please.
Okay, yes, I just have one point. It may be a bit controversial. I hope not, shouldn't be, but
controversy is good.
Central and Eastern Europe, many people, many civil society groups, churches, political parties, all kinds of groups feel squeezed between two viewpoints. The Russian authoritarian one, obviously, and with their local supporters, such as in Hungary, and then a liberal agenda in the EU and in North America, which they don't fully share on a bunch of values. And that's a position of enormous vulnerability, because it's I think in Central and Eastern Europe where this Russian aggression is potentially going to have the biggest effect. I think we need to think and educate ourselves and our leaders and our wordsmiths that liberalism is a pluralistic view, and that liberal constitutional democracies can disagree about a lot of policies, even some values, and that what the European Union and NATO is not imposing upon Romania what happens to be the consensus in Vancouver, because that's a recipe for disaster. And that's happening too much. We're not giving Central and Eastern Europe enough space, intellectual and time, to lay the cornerstones of their own liberal constitutional democracy and their form of liberalism. For example, on marriage rights, they may be somewhere different than Canada or Sweden. And we should not make that a litmus test, and chase them into the hands of Russia.
Thank you. Marcus?
Go ahead.
Okay.
Well, I mean, if we're talking about this attack on our democracy and disinformation as such, you know, I spoke about raising awareness through literacy campaigns and such. And if we talk about our elections, I mean, there are some simple things that we can do. I mean, looking at what happened in the US, a large part of what caused their problems was weak security. DNC servers were hacked, emails were hacked. They were exposed through Russian channels or WikiLeaks, which is basically the FSB and GRU working together. We're absolutely vulnerable in this country. Extremely vulnerable. Anyone who has worked on a political campaign in this country, anybody who's worked within the party structure in this country will tell you that you can get into a campaign, be a number 2, 3, 4 person in that campaign, and you will have access to national lists within that party structure. That's terrifying, because that person's email, I think most of us probably don't use two-factor authentication when we go into our email. When you don't use that, it's extremely easy to hack an email. Once you get into an email, you can find passwords and you can get into one of these systems. Once you're in that system, then a state actor or someone else, someone with more nefarious sort of intentions, can go in and actually target those names on that list and really hold sway over not the outcome of an election, but can really do some serious damage. We're not there yet. We're not anywhere close to that. So something that this government can do is actually try and produce some sort of guidelines and educate political parties on the national level, local level, provincial, municipal, federal, about how to protect themselves and their voter list. And I think that Elections Canada could do much of the same thing. So that's just one way that we can protect ourselves and learn from the US example.
I'm going to use two metaphors here. One is food and one is war. When it comes to information, we've never had more access to information than at any time in history. This has never happened before. And it's equivalent to saying we've never had more access to food. Here in North America, and particularly in the United States, this is a problem. We've never had more access to food, which is why we are all fat and diabetic now. Because we're making lousy choices about that food. And of course, the answer, again, the people who think that government action is the answer say, well, we have to go and close down McDonald's and Wendy's and Arby's all in these neighborhoods where people are getting fat. Or the other option is you try to create more places where there are fruits and vegetables, and you can't make people eat well, but you can provide alternatives. I think one of the things we need to do is to provide those alternatives so that anywhere in the world, yes, you're not going to be able to escape RT. They're very good at what they do, but I think that you should always be able to tune in the BBC or CNN or any of the French stations or German television, and give people these alternatives. Because I think that one place, and maybe this is where government action can help somehow to ease the restrictions on the spread of this kind of news. You can't make people watch it, but I also think we should learn something from the Cold War, which is not to politicize this. Because the thing I think that made Radio Liberty and Radio Free Europe so effective is that they just went for straight news. They delivered the news. There was a time when Radio Free Europe tried to do anti-Soviet propaganda, and people in the Eastern Bloc just tuned it out. They're like, oh, we've heard this before. We know how this goes. Provide these alternatives. So I think this on the dietary metaphor is you're not going to be able to shut down all the junk food, but you can provide better alternatives, and you can try to proliferate those and to create more options. The metaphor for war, I think, is one of mobilization. And I think back to the Cold War. The United States, I'm a product of the Cold War. I mean, I learned Russian, through places that had Russian programs because of the National Defense Education Act. We need to have a full court press on things like digital literacy, civic education, history, just as something as simple as history. The historical illiteracy of the average, even in Europe, but particularly in the United States, I can't speak for Canada, is astonishing. It's staggering. That, when people say to somebody my age, what's your deal with the Russians? What's the big deal about them? Well, there is a history here. We do have something to discuss. And I found, I actually started offering a course at the Harvard Extension School on Cold War popular culture. Because every time I would give a lecture in some other course on the nuclear arms race or nuclear weapons or the Cold War, I'd get the kind of teens and 20-somethings sitting back and going, oh, here goes Grandpa again. I don't know what the big deal is about this. Nuclear weapons, blah, 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 blah. Well, today's Thursday. Tonight, my class, I won't be with them, but they're going to watch the BBC movie Threads, which, if you haven't seen it, is like the British version of The Day After, only gory. I mean, it's really the NC-17 rated version of nuclear war. And generally speaking, it scares the hell out of them. And that's exactly what I intended to do. And it produces, I think generally, when you introduce students to this historical reality, it induces in them a kind of new seriousness about thinking about this stuff. And I think that we have to get past, the notion that everything is about the next 6 months. We have to have more civic education, more historical education, and more education about values. And by this, I don't mean values. I share your concern, values of the left or values of the right, but rather the values such as the ability to tell truth from fact, or truth from lies, the value of listening to other human beings when they speak, the value of having a vote in the public space to control your own life. These are things that we can agree on broadly and in a multi-partisan, not bipartisan way, and we're not doing it. I don't think we're doing enough of it, and I don't think enough of it's being done in Europe. I will leave it aside to the Canadians to talk about whether it's being done here. But I think we've just kind of left it aside and we've dropped. I think Putin and the Russians have taken advantage of the fact that the Western societies have thrown the last 40 years or so into the memory hole. Yeah. And that's hurting us badly.
Well, I can certainly confirm that we have a problem with that as well, and that teaching history to particularly the undergrad students is quite a challenge these days, but we certainly need to find a way to do it better and to do far more of it. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Can I just quickly follow up on the food metaphor.
Oh, please do.
You know, it brings up one thing, providing alternatives. Canada is really wonderful at producing diversity programming and multicultural programming. So the 400,000 Russians, for example, who are living here in Canada, the vast majority of them get their information directly beamed in from Moscow. Whether it's with NTV or RTV, it doesn't matter. They're getting their information from the source of the propaganda. This is problematic. What we can do, we have, like I said, experience with Omni television, all this diversity programming that we've done for years. What the Canadian government really could do is help enable that and produce that and develop that further so that maybe we can produce some alternative Russian language programming and news and such for our own diaspora group here, but also work with Americans, work with our NATO allies, and produce a much larger alternative that's credible and that these people can watch as an alternative.
Well, given that the food metaphors are so popular today, I can only say you've given us much food for thought. And on this note, it is my great pleasure to launch the Q&A session. The way we're going to do this is if you would please put your hands up, a mic would magically come to you. We'll take batches of 3 questions. Can I invite you to very briefly introduce yourselves, and please keep your questions short so that we can hear from as many people as possible. And where is the mic? Okay, so please, a gentleman here. Yes. Can I ask the... Yeah.
Are we go? Yes, we're go. Question for Tom Nichols. Eric Morse from the Royal Canadian Military Institute in Toronto. Question for Tom. You said that it would be inadvisable for governments to impose controls on social media, as in fact has happened in China and Russia already. Is it possible that we simply haven't evolved towards the understanding of social media as the new mainstream media, and that they in fact have to recognize that they are the new mainstream media and start acting like it? Because William Randolph Hearst was no saint. He started many a good war in his day. But Zuckerberg has to understand that he is now a media mogul and take responsibility for it.
I agree with that completely.
Wait a second. Can I ask for 2 more questions? We'll take 3 questions.
Sure.
Sorry, just because we have so many people. Yes, at the back of the room, yes? Yes, over there.
Hello, my name's Akash Maharaj. I'm with the Global Organization of Parliamentarians Against Corruption. As you can probably guess, we're very concerned with Russia. My question to the panel is about, is related to a point all 3 of you made, and that is the risk that cyber warfare could inadvertently or intentionally trip over into actual warfare. But it does strike me that to a certain extent has already happened. There are Russian troops in Crimea, in Ukraine's eastern oblast, and in 20% of Georgia. So with that in mind, my question is, what do you think NATO or Western powers can do to reestablish a sense of deterrence? Because it strikes me that these things would not have happened if the Russians felt that there was a credible risk of adverse consequences had they taken these steps.
Okay, and one more question. Oh dear. Okay, Bob, please, if you can. We'll have time for more, don't worry.
My name is Robert Haig. I was a diplomat in the Foreign Service for 38 years. I was responsible this year as well for working with the CIC to bring Professor Stephen Kotner from Princeton into a CIC meeting to talk about Russia. He's writing a book, a trilogy on Stalin, and his comment was he was obviously condemning what Putin is doing, But what really got him was the way that he's impoverishing the Russian worker. The oligarchs are doing well. Russia economically is not doing well. I believe that the Russian worker, his lifespan is less than during the Soviet period. So my question is Russia becoming, unlike China, economically irrelevant?
Thank you. So if I could invite the panelists, Tom, would you?
Yeah, just a quick response to Eric's comment. I hope that these social media companies start to understand that they have to exercise some sort of internal discipline. You've already saw it. I mean, Twitter has now banned tens of thousands of accounts. Facebook has started to impose more requirements for transparency on who advertises with them. These are all good starts, but yeah, I mean, this is a new form of media. I think the techno-optimism is kind of draining away, and you know that having technology available to everybody doesn't make everybody into a good person. That there are bad people who, you know, I mean, Alfred Nobel figured this out when he invented dynamite, right? And it's like, oh my God, bad people are going to use this. So I think that those, but again, I am deeply worried about the knee-jerk response that says, you know, the government ought to establish fact-checking offices, and you know, I mean, why don't we just call it the Ministry of Truth and get it over with? So I don't want to see that. As for the question of cyber deterrence, you know, the information space is now part of the landscape of war. And I think I don't have a technical fix to this. I'm an old school politics guy, and I think that deterrence is established through expression of will. And I think that we can we can renuclearize Europe and forest it with troops. And if we keep, as we've been doing for quite a long time now, if we keep communicating to the Russians that we're not really serious about this, none of it will matter. I don't think you need to spend a lot of money. You need to shore up the political unity and the messaging from NATO as a means of will to say, you know, I think Alex, you said, you know, tripwires are a little shaky. Tripwires can be quite effective if the message that comes with it is, no matter how small it is, if that tripwire is broken, the consequences for you will be dire. And I just don't think we've had the fortitude and the will to send that message. The one thing I have tried to tell everybody, and to aim this message at the Russians as much as I can, is never make the mistake of thinking NATO is just the president of the United States. NATO is a big organization, has a lot of moving parts, and that you can set that juggernaut in motion without realizing what you're doing, and you'd better be a lot more careful about not, you know, turning those gears so that that machine starts to move. But beyond that, I have always thought that the problem of deterrence in general, and of NATO specifically, is a problem of willpower.
Thank you. Alex?
A couple of very quick points in response to the questions. To Eric's point, you know, even if you could find a normative reason to try to legislate and control social media because it's kind of the new mainstream, you still will have this technical problem all the time. For example, just the time when we figure out what are actually human beings versus computers, there'll be another way to actually make it very difficult to find out that they're not human beings. So you are going to have a constant catch-up. The cyber question, you know, one of the big problems with cyber, of course, and that's why we use attribution and resilience rather than deterrence, is because you can try to make a static line between physical damage and cyber and call that deterrence, but that can change any moment. And also, there's something very different about cyber, because when you launch a cyber attack, you actually show your blueprint. So it's a very different thing from a nuclear kind of deterrence. It's a very, very different domain of deterrence. So if we think about deterrence in nuclear ways, we have to think about it differently, and perhaps it's not even possible. But finally, I think On the economic weakness, I agree with you, and I think there's lots of evidence that the economy in Russia is suffering beside demography. But let's remember, the Soviet Union was able to have 4 decades of superpower status with a worse economy. And also, increasingly, there is a mutually self-serving relationship between China and Russia that could compensate for a lot of things. So the Russian seriousness, I think, is not diminished by its economic challenges in the short run.
And it shores up the regime, because they blame us.
Yeah.
When people, I mean, the Russians have a remarkable victim mentality. And so in some ways, the suffering of the Russian worker actually redounds to Putin's benefit, because he can say, this is what it would be worse, but for me, it would be worse, because this is what the West is doing to you.
A very quick follow-up, if I may. It was a very funny story for us as Canadians. When we came to Latvia with these 40 students, the story at the time was that on Russian newspapers in Latvia, about 33% of the population speaking Russian, that real estate prices in Riga were up because all these NATO troops, all these rich Canadians were buying houses. You know, even though I think, we then went to Campadasi and other places. We found out they all live an hour and a half away from the city, and there's only 2.5 officers that are allowed to live in the city in modest apartments. But, you know, this is the kind of attack you're getting, and I agree with Tom's earlier comment that you can never actually be effective in countering, because you're always playing way behind the ball, way behind the ball.
Thank you, Marcus.
I would just, to Eric's question about Facebook, I think Facebook and Twitter are improving. My own experience with Facebook and Kremlin trolls goes back to 2007. In 2007, my grandfather, who I made a film of his experience in the Gulag in 1941-42. We got into a car in 2004 and drove from Tallinn to the far north of Russia. And we sort of filmed his entire experience and his story along the way. It was in 2008, actually, just after the Georgian War. I was publicly quite critical of what was happening in Georgia. And suddenly, a hijacked or a fake social media profile, Facebook profile of my grandfather appeared. My grandfather had been dead for a year, and he wasn't very computer literate either, so it was impossible for him to do it. So what they'd done is they'd hijacked a photo of my grandfather, and then they started posting all sorts of material that made him seem like a neo-Nazi or a fascist, in order to discredit our film, which was quite popular and won all sorts of awards, me as a filmmaker and his story itself. Now, the point of me telling you this is that I, of course, complained to Facebook at the time and said, you need to get this off. It took them about a month to remove it. And back then, I would say there was probably a fraction of the users that are on there today. The amount of users that they have today make it very difficult to police everything that's going on there. Let's just be realistic about it. Further to Alex's point, you can't tell. Nowadays, with AI, it's very difficult to tell what's automated and what's real. But they are getting much better. There's, I think, a piece in The Atlantic just last week, which just, it commented on the fact that Facebook is removing a lot of fake profiles now and a lot of fake ads, and I've noticed it as well. Twitter is not so good at it, but I believe that Facebook truly does want to work on it, and things will improve.
Keep in mind that 20-year-olds are not on Facebook.
Yeah,
It's true.
It's true.
Yeah.
They're not doing that anymore. They're Instagram and other stuff. So just by the time we fix Facebook, they're somewhere else.
But the Facebook demographic is a very highly voting demographic.
Well, yeah.
That is true.
For now.
Okay, thank you so much. We do have time for, yes, please, if I could have the mic over here.
Thank you. My name is Paul Bennett. I was with various government departments. It strikes me as unfortunate that while we're having this problem with perhaps a deterioration in values and disinformation, that we have the same thing coming from the various highest position in the United States.
Okay. Another question? Yes, please. And we'll do that. Yeah.
Richard Cohen, former military officer and senior advisor to a past Minister of Defense. We talked a little bit about tripwires, and I think Tom made the point that we need to demonstrate will in the West to convince Mr. Putin that our tripwire is real. I would take a slightly different slant on that, and I would say that we, aside from demonstrating will, the will has to be manifested in robust military power, because a tripwire is only effective as a deterrent if you have the wherewithal to follow up what happens afterwards, after the wire is tripped. It seems to me that we don't yet have that. And we've had no mention yet of the NATO 2% goal and the fact that most NATO countries are not, including Canada as a prime example, is not even trying to reach that goal. That sends the wrong message to Mr. Putin. And unless we do that as a demonstration of will, then I think we run the real risk, as you've mentioned, Tom, that Mr. Putin will engage in some pretty dangerous military adventure.
Yes.
Comments?
Okay, yes, and we have one question over there as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Andrew Rasulis, Canadian Global Affairs Institute. In the Cold War, the objective of the West was essentially deterrence. Hold on to what we have. The competition was fundamentally political and economic. Different economic system in the Soviet Union and a different political system. That's not there today. Essentially, economically speaking, we're all playing in the same economic sandbox, the Chinese, the Russians, the West, and so on. Politically, they're more authoritarian. They have certain democratic frameworks, but they have parliaments and so on, but a certain fundamental element of authoritarianism and a certain measure of oligarchism in terms of their economies. But fundamentally, we're playing in the same sandbox. So we knew what the Soviet objective was in the Cold War. That was essentially push out the Western system and replace it with their system, which would make it work better. What is the Soviet or the Russian view today? What is their end state, their strategic objective? We've talked a lot about their disruptive mechanisms, cyber warfare, military probings, and so on. But what is their objective? What is their end state? What do they want to achieve?
Okay, thank you. Let me turn to the panelists who would like to give us. Alex?
Yes, Mr. Bennett's comment, I think the term you used was unfortunate. Most of us would, of course, say it's far worse than that. It's a calamity. That the clarity, and this is what I meant by exceptionalism and the whole tradition, a calamity that our biggest bully pulpit has been lost for the time being. It's a calamity. You know, concerning the tripwire, as you were talking about, I think it's very important, given especially at the theater level. And this is kind of contradictory because the political idea about tripwire is not per se traditionally at the theater level, because it was all about escalation and the risks of actually tripping. But now it's different because of the challenges with area defense and denial, with the challenges of shorter range nuclear weapons, all these layers. The actual robustness of theater is more relevant now, I think, in terms of calculations. For example, in crisis management operations like Afghanistan, stationary artillery was quite fine. Stationary artillery in Latvia makes no sense. You have to have the best mobile artillery in order to have people calculate, even if it's just at the national or theater level, about what kind of responses come from 400 green folks walking in so far. So this is what I mean about fortifying the tripwire, and it's something Canada could do. It's really quite within our capacity if our decision makers and the people involved realize that this mattered. Final point is about, I disagree a little bit with the premise of your statement. I don't think we are playing in the same sandbox economically. What drives Russia is state-operated, state-owned enterprises. Under Xi Jinping, what has increased the most is state-owned enterprises. That's a different economy from a market, liberal, free economy. And it's one of the key things to emphasize, that it brings different effects. It requires different laws, real property laws, real courts, courts that are independent. So if you have a real market, then you need all the other political pieces too. If you're just an authoritarian state with state-owned enterprises, you're a whole different beast. So I think we need to make sure that we bring those competition of values and ideas right out.
Okay, thank you. Yes?
I guess I'll jump the queue since very clearly a question about the American president. And I guess this is a good time to remind everybody that I do not speak for the U.S. government. This is my personal view.
We could have a chair for you at my university.
No one back home will ever mistake me for a fan or a booster of the president. And I think that his role in this problem of weeding out truth from just the basic kind of civic duty of what's true and what's false, I think his role has been highly destructive. You know, I think for the president, truth is transactional. It's really a matter of what's useful to him at any given moment. It's important to remember the president was, you know, one of the birther guys. And it makes me crazy every time he uses the term fake news, because he's now created an alternate reality for about 30% or so of the American public. And I mean that. I mean that. I mean, it is an alternate reality. When he says fake news, he means news he doesn't like. And there is now, you know, 30% of the public. He has told them point blank, you can't believe anybody but me. This is not a democratic value. It just isn't, to have the leader of the country say, no one will tell you the truth but me. So, you know, there's just, he's the president, he's the commander-in-chief until the American people or the Congress say he's not, and that's all there is to it. But I think it's important. This is why the institutions of, you know, journalism, who have had a rough go. I mean, you know, they've made a lot of mistakes. They've walked into they've stepped on a few rakes themselves because they have reacted to Trump so strongly. And I think that they have, you know, more or less righted the ship. That first year, though, I think they were all running around with their hair on fire, which is exactly what he wanted. And I think, you know, things are leveling up. But there's no arguing with your point. I mean, the president's role in this has been, you know, corrosive. As for tripwires, you know, I actually I start from the assumption that the Russians really aren't capable of a sustained conflict in Europe. And that they really don't want that. That they are facing, that as sluggish as we are, even though we're not meeting our targets, that in fact, they will have local superiority, they will win immediately in the short term, and then they will spend the next few months trying to figure out how to get out of what they did to themselves. That's the time that I think is the most dangerous. And it will require careful diplomacy and strength and a demonstration of will to say, we will let you off the hook. You know, what do you do about these 400 guys on 300 meters of NATO territory? Because I think what Putin really wants to establish is that Article 5 is meaningless. Even if it's just 1 square meter of meaningless, it's meaningless. Because that is just his atavistic reflex. And so to say, look, we will find you a way out of this, but don't think that you can escalate your way out of this because it won't go well for you. Don't ever think that. Don't ever believe it. Unfortunately, the messages, going back to your point, the messages we're sending are, you know, NATO's a protection racket and everybody better pay up. And that's not very useful. But again, that's why I always say NATO is more than any one American president. As for your question about their end game, I look at it very simply based on the kind of regime it is. The end game is to keep Vladimir Putin in power forever. Yeah. Whatever works to do that. I take Alex's point about state enterprises, but I will differ with you about the same sandbox. I think Henry Kissinger was absolutely right when he said, this is an unprecedented moment in history when all the major powers are finally all dependent on the same system of trade and cooperation. You know, historians hate to ever say that nothing has ever happened before, but this has pretty much never happened before, right? And if Kissinger's willing to say it, I think that says something. I think he's right. With that said, the costs, because of the kinds of regimes involved, the costs that each of the players in that game are willing to inflict on their own people in the name of regime survival vary greatly. And that's what makes China, and particularly Russia, so dangerous. That Russia says, yes, we have to be players in the international economy, but I will happily drive my life expectancy of the average Russian worker down to 54 if that's what it takes to keep me in the game, my enterprise is making money, and me sitting in the big chair inside the Kremlin. So I think that's their strategic end goal right now.
Okay, Marcus?
Certainly, and I think also rebuilding sort of Soviet hegemony in that entire region. So breaking apart NATO is very, very much a part of that. Russia can't compete with NATO. Russia can't compete with the European Union. So it needs to break these institutions and alliances into small pieces. That's the only way that he's going to compete, and that all plays into the larger goal of maintaining power, I think.
Why does Russia want Brexit? It does.
Yeah.
Because it makes a smaller UK, and it serves the eventual goals of that regime to stay in power.
I just hope we're not overemphasizing the robustness of NATO without strong U.S. leadership and engagement. Because without strong leadership and engagement, I would say NATO you can walk over it in a couple days. Yeah. So let's not make it too strong.
Now, we are quickly running out of time, but I do know there were a couple of people who have been very patiently waiting. Brian, are we allowed to take another 5 minutes?
Depends on whether it's 5 minutes Canadian, 5 minutes American, or 5 minutes Russian.
Okay, we're not going to take
5 Russian minutes.
We're not going to take the 5 minute Russian version. Okay, let me tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to invite people who've been waiting to raise very quickly, very briefly raise their questions, and I will give 1 minute to the panelists to either respond to that or simply issue any final thoughts they might have. Is that okay? All right. So please, go ahead, the mic.
Wilbrit Faux, and my question will be very short. I think it's you, Tom. You touched very briefly the role of the Russian mafia. Can you elaborate more on that, please?
We need 3 days for that. And there is one final question over there.
Hi, my name is Kasia Jarmol. I'm a trade commissioner with the Global Affairs Canada. And I just had a question to 3 panelists. Are sanctions actions taken by Canada, the EU, and the US against Russia since 2014 having the intended effect of forcing a change of behavior by that state? And how can sanctions be better utilized to address these concerns?
Okay. Now, to the panelists, you have the difficult task of taking, let's say, 1.5 minutes to either respond to those questions or perhaps include any final thoughts you might have. Tom, would you like to get us started?
Comment on the Russian media. Aren't I in enough trouble? I think one thing that Americans don't understand, and this is if you're trying to understand how the Americans are approaching the Russians, and this Russia scandal that we're mired in right now, I've tried to get Americans to understand that when you deal with the Russian oligarchs, you are dealing with the Russian mafia, which means you are dealing with the Russian intelligence services, which means you are dealing with the Russian government and the Russian president's office, because they're all the same people. Amen. So this, Americans, because of course, we like to make those divisions of, well, we have government over here and the mafia and stuff. They don't understand these are all nested like a Russian doll, all within each other. So I think when we talk about the Russian mafia, I would rather just say, you know, the Russian power structures as they currently exist, because the whole thing is a mafia. As for sanctions, the problem with sanctions against an authoritarian government is sanctions only work if the government isn't willing to hurt its own people. And I don't see a lot of change in Russia's behavior because the Russian government is willing to hurt its own people a lot. Now, with that said, one place I think sanctions, two places I think sanctions could matter, and I'll end on this very quickly. One is if it starts to really hurt the oligarchs, then, you know, when the capos get unstable, the boss gets unstable. So, you know, the targeting of sanctions, I think, could be a little done a little more accurately. And the other is, you know, since the order to attack the United States and its institutions came directly from Putin, I think we ought to spend a little more time, you know, outing Putin and his sources of wealth and where it is. I mean, if Putin wants to play this game, let's play this game. And let's you know, he plays hardball, we'll play hardball. Paul, going back to your point, that's not going to happen in this administration. But it is a way, I think the Europeans could do it, I think others could do it, but I think that would, now, you know, do you push Putin into a corner and make him lash out militarily? Now we're back to the question of will and what, you know, how do you close off all these other options to say, look, you're better off and you stay in power by cooperating and taking your foot off the gas in places like Ukraine, that, you know, that you make this a better calculation for Putin. He is not entirely irrational. I disagree with the people who think he's a master strategist. I think he's actually quite bad at strategy, but he is clever, and he has a great sense of self-preservation, and we need to start appealing to that.
Okay, thank you. Marcus.
On sanctions quickly, yes, they're working. We know that they're working because we can see how Vladimir Putin is reacting to them. His oligarchs are not happy. Much of the Russia scandal that we're seeing right now, the meeting that happened in Trump Towers, it's all about sanctions. He cannot stand the sanctions. They are driving him bonkers. He needs to get rid of them. What we're not doing well enough in the US, and certainly here in Canada, and by the way, we do know that they keep their money here in Canada. There's a former Russian senator who's now being removed from his position because he had over $100 million in real estate in Toronto. He didn't declare it, so Putin forced him out of that position. They keep their money here. Roman Abramovich has Avraz Steel. They keep their money here. Deripaska. They don't want these sanctions. The problem with the Canadian government right now is that we have this wonderful sanctioning legislation modeled after the US version of Magnitsky legislation. We're not using it. We should be looking at the folks that are running RT. Slap them with sanctions. Let's look at the propagandists. Let's broaden these sanctions because they hurt. They don't like them. They're not sectoral. We're not hurting the Russian people, but we're hurting the people that need to be affected by these things. So that's my quick answer on sanctions.
Thank you so much. Final word, Alex.
Just my call to you is to help Canadians think and talk about what many Canadians think are old-fashioned, outdated problems, like the state, security, war and peace. In Vancouver, this can be very challenging, and I'm sure it's the same in Toronto. But we must discuss with our fellow citizens these old ideas because they are still with us. There is no new thing under the sun. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. I know we could be here for another 3 days and still have more questions. It is my sad duty to conclude this, but before I do, and before I invite you to thank our panelists for their wonderful comments and answers, can I just say I was moved, Tom, by your story about Air Canada today, and I think we do have the perfect solution for you. Just cancel your flight and stay here. We would be delighted to have you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much to all the panelists. Thanks to all of you for coming here on this beautiful day. Our deep thanks, of course, to Brian and the entire team for hosting us. I think it's been a wonderful event, and we thank you.
My pleasure. Two very quick comments. First of all, to Alex. Alex, I grew up in Vancouver, and Burnaby is not Vancouver. Secondly, I got the good news and the bad news that came out of the discussion today. The good news was I was very struck by the food analogy, the idea that there are many bad options out there, and our job is to put better, more healthful alternatives out there. And then Marcus started to talk about how we have lots of experience in Canada about and then the bad news was I realized the people that we would be getting to do this in Canada are the junior producers at CBC who think RT is a news source. Right? So be careful what you wish for. Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes today's MLI event on Russia's challenges to North American and European security. Please join me in thanking all our speakers, Yanis Garasons, Tom Nichols, Alex Moens, Marcus Kolga, and of course, Alexandra Gaichu from the University of Ottawa. Thank you. Thank you very much to you for attending, and I look forward to seeing you at future MLI events, including our next one on Canadian energy leadership in the Indo-Pacific. It's about the geostrategic importance of Canada's energy resources, which is going to take place on October 4th at 10 a.m. at the Rideau Club. And please stay for coffee and conversation if you can. Thank you and goodbye.